Callum strode through the council chambers. Even though the council was not in session, he felt a need to confer with the Nurrim. The older dragon had moved to the stone chamber once Tyler's small group had gone. He hadn't left since. The white dragon looked up from the engraved map on the central table at Callum's call. The map was only a little different from the one Walter had found in the jewelry box, and much older.
Something troubles you, Callum?
He noted the expression of eye more than anything on his face. Moving closer, the silver-green dragon nodded.
I do not mean to call your attention to this matter, but I am concerned. Would it not have been better to concentrate our focus here? The mage Courtney is barely capable. She seems more set on trying to challenge the other mages than in training. Reconstruction of the fallen city has all but halted because of her.
And what is it she does to disrupt the others so?
Kern inquired with a raised brow. He doubted the claims were as drastic as the other dragon made them out to be, but he was a fair leader. He would hear him out. With a thump of one clawed fist to the stone map, Callum all but blew fire.
She says her talents are best put to sparring with her fellow mages. She's organized them into small groups to test their skills against each other. Against my counsel, might I add. She is headstrong and obstinate and will not listen. And the others are just like her.
Kern listened with patience.
The mages wish to protect us as much as we do them,
he reminded.
While I, too, wish to see the city of the Keepers restored, you must agree that now is not the most advisable time. I do not see how her actions are unjustified.
Callum thumped his tail with impatience.
They are all but as children playing at war. They will only become a hindrance if this continues.
They are young, I grant you.
The Nurrim returned with a wry smile. He leaned one scaled elbow against the stone table.
But their perspective is also fresh, with different insights. Let them play, as you put it. It does no harm. I'm sure you will find their efforts no less than adequate.
The younger dragon bowed with a low rumble.
As you wish.
He excused himself in a bit of a huff, his tail sweeping stone fragments into the air as he went. He might not agree with his leader, but he respected him. The Nurrim had his reasons. He just didn't understand what they were. Darkness fell on the small camp near the outskirts of Old Sorwa. The river had split, one branch continuing south while the other kept west. They had taken the western course. Trees crowded close to the small lake at the end, creating a stable place to set up camp. The rest of the ground squished underfoot from the hidden springs and bogs. The small group found plenty of firewood for the night. Tyler did the honors of kindling a campfire while Walter set up the two tents. With the flames crackling, a heavenly scent filled the air as Tyler cooked the evening meal.
So, think she'll sleep through to morning?
Walter asked as he speared a piece of meat from a small spit over the fire. The rabbit they'd caught was young and tender, taken by sheer chance, but the veteran more than enjoyed the resulting roast. He couldn't help but glance towards the tents, though. Tyler also looked towards the tents, focusing on the smaller of the two. Once the fire had become self-sustaining, he'd placed Anwen inside. She was still out from her earlier exertions with the river.
Who knows, but I'm sure she'll be good to go in the morning.
An owl called out a low, lonely sound. The light trickle of the river filtered in under the fire's crackling noise. Crickets chirped as a gentle breeze made the trees creak.
What do you think we'll find inside the ruin?
Walter asked as he chewed his food. There was no call for standing on ceremony with Tyler. They'd known each other too long. Besides, the dragon was enjoying his food just as much as he was. There likely wouldn't be any leftovers when they were done. Tyler shook his head.
No idea. Despite living in the area, I never got to know Amakeda. Nor do I know who she chose to be the walker. We could be looking for anything.
Walter couldn't help but give him a sidelong glance. His friend's comments were not helpful, and since he'd not actually gone there himself, he didn't know what to expect either. It was a shame, really, but there was no helping it. They'd have to wait for the morning to find out. He hoped it wouldn't include anything too crazy, like unearthing something. They hadn't thought to bring any shovels.
There's always the possibility this first clue will lead us to an easy find.
Tyler continued. He debated on saving some of the rabbit for Anwen, but decided against it. He had no idea how long she'd be out and didn't want to tempt the local wildlife with a free meal. Not that any would dare confront a dragon, but his kind hadn't exactly been out and about for a while. Tyler's conjecture made Walter thoughtful.
That would be a nice change now, wouldn't it?
He mused. So far, not much had come easy for the adventurers, and while it was what he'd been trained to do, he couldn't wait for an actual vacation of some kind. Finding a village full of magical women wasn't quite his cup of tea, even though part of him knew men also inherited the ability to manipulate matter. He volunteered because Emmy had given the map to him. He doubted she'd done that without a good reason. Anwen wasn't sure what woke her at first, but it left her with a pounding heart and short of breath. For the briefest of moments, she had no idea where she was. Then vague impressions filtered into her mind, along with the reminder of their quest. There never was any rest for the weary, she supposed. Yesterday had taken a lot out of her, but that still left the matter of what had woken her. She sat up and looked around, trying to determine the cause, though she couldn't see much from inside the tent walls. Fumbling a bit, she opened the flap and crawled out. Not sure how she'd gotten in there in the first place, but when she saw the other tent, she had a pretty good idea. The area they'd camped in was boggy. She could feel the humidity beating up on her skin as she left the tent. Or was it sweat? Strange noises sounded in the dark, noises she was not familiar with. Things rustled in the tall grasses, water plopped as if someone had thrown a stone into a pond. Insects and other creatures made buzzing sounds or yowled in the gloom. But for all the unaccustomed din, Anwen knew these sounds weren't what had awoken her. Tyler and Walter had pitched their tent against a close hillock. They were both sound asleep. She could hear Walter's snore and thought she felt Tyler's even breathing in her chest. It was a little hard to tell since she was still getting used to the idea of being connected with him. Mist trailed up and around their tent, seeping from the restless eddies around them, made everything look all the more sinister than it might have otherwise. That or it made it look more mysterious. She hadn't decided which yet. Something gurgled in the water. It might be an animal displacing a pocket of air or something similar, or it could be caused by whatever had woken her. Anwen saw something move out of the corner of her eye. She almost violently turned towards the object in question, her eyes going wide. Someone was walking above the water. Whoever it was didn't escape the mist, but they weren't walking on solid ground either. She could tell. There was no telltale sound of squelching footsteps. With the intent of caution, Anwen got to her feet, settling into a low crouch as she grasped the master key with one hand. She wasn't sure if she could persuade the dragon artifact to transform into a sword she knew it contained. Part of her thought the incident with the landslide on the river was a fluke. She'd not been able to control her abilities as a dragon mage should, let alone as the Keda, at least not without Tyler's help. The figure in the mist moved closer, glowing with a faint green light that hinted at new growth and spring. From this distance, Anwen could now see that the individual was female, and for whatever reason, she looked somewhat familiar.
Hello, Anwen.
The figure called out with an all too familiar voice. The sound caused tears to prick at Anwen's eyes, her heart to ache with the memory of loss. The teen couldn't help but stand as the woman came within a few feet of her.
Mom?
This had to be a dream, she thought. It couldn't be real. She knew her mother was dead. She'd been there for her last breath. Margo Pack smiled, her eyes brimming with compassion, though she didn't come any closer.
Oh, my dear daughter.
She continued as though Anwen hadn't spoken at all.
There are so many things I wanted to tell you before I met my end on the mountain. But now I must impart my wisdom in this form.
Something like a sob escaped Anwen's lips. She reached out her hand as if to touch her mother, but Margo took a step back.
I'm sorry,
She apologized to her daughter.
but you must not touch me. I can appear to you in this form because you are the Keda and wear the mage ring. But I have no corporeal form that you can touch.
The older woman raised her hand, a deeper green spark coming from one finger.
As Courtney guessed, all the knowledge and wisdom of the previous Kedas reside in this ring. We will be here to give you knowledge, comfort, and wisdom. You are embarking on a journey of monumental importance. While you seek the Walker, you must also seek skills with your abilities. You will need them.
Anwen blew out a shaky breath. She wished she could give her mother a hug, but knew it would only cause her more heartache.
I saw Emma Kaida.
She confessed.
She told me about the Walker and gave me the first clue. Why didn't you ever tell me about her? or the walker for that matter.
Margo shook her head.
I didn't have that knowledge to give you. That was knowledge only she could impart. It was not passed down to me, nor did I have the knowledge to ask for it when I was living.
She smiled warmly.
Already you have changed so much since I passed on. I'm proud of you.
But her daughter shook her head.
Oh, don't be. I haven't done much.
Anwen thought back to the landslide. She remembered the feel of Tyler's hands on her shoulders, holding her, supporting her.
Tyler's the one who's done all the work, through which he does it. I'm just the vessel through which he does it.
In a gesture that was more characteristic of her mother, Margo shook her head. Her expression was time-worn and disbelieving.
Always so self-effacing. When are you going to open your eyes and realize that you're the one? You did all that. I know you think Tyler guided you when the landslide came, but you heard it a full second before he did. I may not be present in the physical sense, but I can see what you're thinking and remembering. That was all you.
Anwen shook her head to deny it.
There's no way. I'm still a newbie. That can't have been me.
She sat down hard on a nearby tuft of grass, her eyes wide as she shook her head.
It's not possible.
You lack confidence.
Margo stated.
You always have.
She bent to meet her daughter's eyes.
But you have always been able to do anything you've set your mind on doing. And just like all those times from your childhood, you can do this too, if you believe in yourself. It was wrong of me to assume that things would come to you the same way they did for me.
That comment brought Anwen's head back up. She'd stared at the bubbling background below only moments before.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
She confessed. Margo moved a little closer, almost close enough to touch.
I didn't take into account your unique heritage as both the Keda and the Master Keykeeper. Add to that your soul connection with Tyler and, well, let's say it's just completely outside of my experience. You're essentially forging new ground, and we can only give you advice, but I'm honestly not sure how useful it will be. I know you hear differently than any who came before you, just as you see only as the dragons can see. So please be patient with me, and I'll try to be patient with you as well.
Rays of light began to filter down into the camp, fragmented through tree branches and bushes. Facing east, Anwen had to raise her hand to shade it from the growing light. When she looked back to where her mother had stood only a moment before, she was gone. Tyler stirred in his tent. He could tell he wasn't the only one awake, and not just from the smell of the fire Anwen must have tried to start. Walter was still out, which left her as the cause of the interesting smell of burning moss and wood. Unzipping the flap, his suspicions were confirmed.
Need a hand with that?
He asked as he noticed her trying to coax a flame from the smoking fragments she'd gathered. Not all of it dry. Anwen sat back with a huff. She'd hoped to get a small blaze going before anyone else woke up. It figured she'd fail on that end, but she couldn't help but try.
Maybe.
She replied, keeping her reply short. She glared back at the pile of kindling she'd gathered. Part of the problem was because the moss was still wet from the bog. It couldn't be helped. At least, not really, she decided. There wasn't much to work with. With a smile, Tyler ducked back into the tent to wake Walter. He decided it might be best to let her try a little longer. Then, if she chose to ask for help, he'd offer it. In the meantime, it wasn't a bad thing to let her give it a decent go. After all, so far on this trip, she hadn't really needed his help. Perhaps that streak would continue. By the time he re-emerged, Anwen actually had a weak flame going. He had to smile to himself at that, as she fed bits of broken twigs to the hungry flames.
Looks like you got it.
He commented as he walked around to the far side where the packs were. He noticed she'd already taken her tent down and had stowed it. She was getting better at this camping thing.
Better than it was when you first picked out.
She replied as she slipped a few larger pieces of wood onto the coals. They caught the heat and fire burst out along their edges. She didn't dare mention how long it had actually taken her to get this much of a blaze going. Not that she could call it a blaze yet, but at least there was enough of a flame to warm up the breakfast bread. A few minutes later, Walter left the tent, bending to lace up his boots.
Any coffee yet?
He asked, not even looking up. The breeze had shifted enough to waft any smoke away from him. Finished with his laces, he looked up in time to see Tyler placing the pot on the coals.
Well, I'll take that as a Not yet, right?
He sighed.
You know, I sure could use a good cup of coffee about now.
Anwen couldn't help but smile at that. She wasn't fond of the taste, let alone the smell. The first time she tasted it was by accident when she was 5. She'd been so disgusted with it that she'd sworn never to drink it again. She hadn't started yet and didn't intend to any time soon. But if others wanted to, that was their business. So long as they didn't expect her to join them. She preferred hot cocoa anyway. Soon the smell of coffee filled the air. Walter smiled as he closed his eyes and took in the aromatic scent.
That's what I'm talking about.
He sighed as Tyler poured him the mug and passed it over.
Makes me feel like I can do anything.
Rolling her eyes, Anwen passed around the toast she'd managed to make. It was a bit singed around the edges, but still edible. Tyler grinned as he accepted his portion. Her mother had told them all how she couldn't cook. Her offering didn't surprise him on quality, though he felt Margo hadn't given her as much credit as she deserved. If he scraped off the edges, the toast was actually quite agreeable.
So, where is this lonely temple?
Anwen asked between bites of toast. It was definitely one of her better efforts, she decided. To her knowledge, they had yet to come across anything that really looked like ruins. Of course, they'd only just reached the tree line, at least from what she could see. Tyler pointed to the northwest.
That way. I guess we have an hour's worth of hiking through the foliage before we reach the ruins. The temple could be any building among them.
Walter gave him a look.
So, you mean you don't know which one?
He pursed his lips.
That's helpful.
He took another sip of coffee before dunking his bread in it. The toast was a bit hard, but wasn't anywhere near as bad as some of the rations he'd had while on the reserves. The Dragon Lord ran his fingers through his hair.
It's been a long time.
He confessed.
A lot has changed since then. I haven't been there in a few centuries.
Anwen gave him a wry look.
Well, if you're done, we should break camp and head out. I have no idea how many clues there are, but I do know we don't have a lot of time.
That said, she brushed off the crumbs. She then went to fill the collapsible bucket with water to put out the fire. This left the two men to stare at her retreating form. For the briefest of moments, her comments and tone reminded them of Margo.